Yo, yo, yo! Welcome back to the MMA Short Show. As always, your boy, Stephen Moustaris. And I have to admit, I still am a little confused here about UFC 306 this weekend. Is it Noche UFC? Is it the Sphere card? Is it the Riyadh season card? Is it really a Mexican Independence Day? Like, which one are we doing here? And if it's all of them at the same time, no wonder all of us are confused. But when it comes to the actual fights and us being fans, man, I really think it's going to be an amazing fight card. We got some amazing matchups, and let alone that, I think it's going to be really cool to see this at a new venue like the Sphere. I'm excited to see, all this hype around it. I'm excited to see how they pull this off. And even though I won't be there to watch it, I'm sure it's still going to be pretty awesome, watching it on TV or whatever on pay-per-view. But, when it comes to these fight nights, man, or most pay-per-views or anything, main events or, the height fights, usually the way of the outcomes. Okay, if this guy's going to win, it's got to be knockout. And if his opponent's going to win, usually a submission or grinded out decision or something, or, avoid the big right hand, avoid the left hook. Whichever way, the victory or the path to victory for most people. And I think that's why I'm so intrigued by this Diego Lopes and Brian Ortega fight this weekend. It always makes the fight a little more interesting whenever you got two guys who are so dominant in one certain thing when it comes to their respective martial arts. Like both of these guys, if you're going to make a list out of jiu-jitsu artists, let alone at 145, if you're going to make a list of the best jiu-jitsu players when it comes to 135 all the way to 170, maybe even 185, and shit, maybe even the entire UFC. I mean, the two guys you're going to see on that list most of the time are going to be Brian Ortega and Diego Lopes. And I think that's why this fight's going to be so much fun. We see this all the time when styles clash. When we saw it against, Colby and good old Kamaru Usman, or you see it sometimes when, the Derek Lewis and, Francis Ngannou, these knockout artists go up against each other. It doesn't always play out the way you expect. And that's why I'm having such a tough time picking this weekend. I'm torn because off rip, just on paper, I want to say Brian Ortega. He's got a little more experience. He's got a little more experience when it comes to fighting higher level and, closer to the title contentions and whatnot, and even the title fights. And we've seen him almost damn near win against Volkanovski and stuff. But, the one thing that's kind of hurt me when it comes to Brian Ortega, he's been pretty vocal about his, mental health, the last few years and where he even lies when it comes to these divisions and the title aspirations and everything. It almost seems like sometimes he's 1 foot out and 1 foot in. And it's kind of like what we saw at UFC 300 when he backed out of this fight the day of. Like, I don't understand what he was like. I still haven't got a clear, reason of why. Something, I think I heard food poisoning. Then there's other people say he just didn't feel good. There's some other people that just said he was depressed and just didn't want to do it. So, for all of this to come out, this is the last sport you want to go into and kind of be half in, half out, especially against a killer like Diego Lopes. But to be fair to every fighter, I can only base it off your last performance. And if we're basing it off that Yair Rodriguez matchup, I mean, my goodness, it's going to be really hard for anybody to pick against Brian Ortega when he's fighting like that. I mean, you made Yair Rodriguez, who, hometown hero, fighting in Mexico City, doing all these things, and you went out there and made him gas within the first 2 rounds, but your pace was so high. And I know they were at elevation and everything, but this man, Yair Rodriguez, got one of the best gas tanks that we've ever seen, especially when it comes to striking and 5 rounds and going to war and pushing the pace the entire time. Like, Yair's the man. So to see somebody like, Diego Lopes, to be fair, he fought Dan Ige on 10 seconds notice because Ortega backed out. But as impressed as I was by Diego Lopes that night, the one thing that was very glooming and very eye-opening to everybody was that gas tank at the end of that fight looked terrible. And if you're set to fight, Brian Ortega at such a high level for 3 rounds and such a big fight, I mean, this man Brian Ortega is we saw him gas Yair, like I just said, like he's even when he's getting his ass beat, like Max Holloway's doing to him or Volk or whatever. I mean, the dude looks like he's dead out there, but he's still pushing. He's still doing it. He's got that Mexican pride. So if we're basing it off all of this, man, as great as Diego Lopes is looking, as much as he's starting to fall in love with his striking, we can't forget Brian Ortega has already been there too. Yeah, sure, they're so good at grappling and submitting and everything and submissions, all these things, but what happens when they start falling in love with their striking? And you've seen it. Brian Ortega went out there starting knocking people out. You see it with this man, with Diego Lopes starting to knock people out. So clearly, I think this fight, what I'm leaning towards, I think this fight's going to end up being a standout fight. The only way I think this goes to the ground is if Brian Ortega gets this man Diego Lopes exhausted, or if somebody rocks him, clearly, and they're not afraid to chase. But I really think it's going to be a glorified stand-up match. And I'm telling you right now, for some reason, I know Diego Lopes is on fire. I know Brian Ortega is kind of half in, half out. He's kind of been around and saw, where he kind of lies when it comes to everything. But it's so hard for me to pick against Brian Ortega. I really think he goes out there with a smart game plan. I think he proves to the world, like, hey, I just needed that little like month or two off to kind of unwind a little bit since UFC 300, and now that I'm back and feeling better, like, let's get crazy here, man. Let's do it. So I'm looking forward to it. I can't wait for it, but if we're being honest, man, I really think Brian Ortega is going to get this man Diego Lopes gassed, and I think this is where, Brian Ortega just shows, hey, man, there's levels to this game. There's experience that you have to do, and this is going to be a huge learning lesson for Diego Lopes, but regardless, Diego Lopes, if this man wins, wouldn't be shocked either, especially, like I said, all the problems that we see with Brian Ortega, it feels like he's half in, half out, so I'm absolutely intrigued to see who wins. This is a cool fight where I don't really have a favorite regardless, and whoever wins, I'm just excited to see it and excited to see where they go when it comes to this 145, division. You're telling me Brian Ortega and Diego Lopes wouldn't be a perfect matchup against Ilia Topuria and really like test him? And sure, you're gonna have the striking, battle and everything, but this man Diego Lopes and Brian Ortega are not afraid to throw. And good luck if they get your back or get you on the ground. Good luck to most people. So, it's always your boy Steven Moustaris. Y'all let me know what you think, but I cannot wait for UFC 306, and this is by far my favorite fight of the entire card. So, it's always your boy, and let's go, baby.